Okay, class. Following on from our February Revolution in 1917, this lesson we're going to be looking at the October Revolution, so the other end of the year. Um, well, we talked about dual power um, between the Soviet and the Duma, which came out of the February Revolution. And now I want to talk a little bit about. I want to start talking about the Kornilov affair. Now, Kornilov was the commander in chief of the army at the time, and when we say dual power, there's a strong argument that it was actually a three. It was you can't really say dual. It's probably a three-way because the way that the only reason that the Soviets and the Duma kind of worked together so well was because there was this fear that the army could come in at any time and just take back control. The Tsar had actually, in the February Revolution, um, written to Kornilov and said, "Can you please take control of Petrograd?" And Kornilov had written back something to the effect of, "I think we're better off without you." Um, Now, so we've got this unstable situation of dual power in Petrograd. The two images here, we have Kornilov at the top and we have Kerensky at the bottom. Now, Kerensky was quite worried about the Bolsheviks, and there's some evidence that he actually asked Kornilov to bring some troops, or Kornilov offered to bring some troops in, and Kerensky agreed. So Kornilov moves these troops just around the capital, and Kerensky starts to get a bit worried that yes, Kornilov could come in and put down any Bolshevik agitators, but he will also then most probably take power for himself. So we have this interesting situation where all of a sudden Kerensky doesn't want Kornilov there anymore, um, and what actually happens is a lot of Kornilov's troops that he's bringing in get diverted into sidings on the train lines on the railway by revolutionary railwaymen. And then the Red Guards come in. So remember, the Red Guards are like the Bolshevik, kind of like their militias. They're made up of the sailors and the soldiers and the workmen as well that took part in that February Revolution. You know, got the arms from the armories and the military factories and that sort of stuff. And so these Red Guards rock up and they use all their propaganda and everything and persuade them not to actually invade Petrograd itself. And this totally takes the fear of the military away. And so this ends up creating allowing the dual power thing just to end up dissolving. Since there's no possibility of the High Command retaking Petrograd, there's no real need for them to work together anymore. And this also pushes the Bolsheviks up to being heroes, and it increases their popularity exponentially. And we see this eventually in September 5 and September 8th in the elections for the Soviets in Moscow and Petrograd, where they get massive increases in their support. So this is the first time we have a real mass following of the Bolsheviks as a party. People haven't really latched onto the Bolsheviks. Most of the big votes are going to the social revolutionaries, the party the peasants like. The Kornilov crisis confirms the Bolshevik message that radical social change cannot come through compromise with the bourgeoisie. Remember, the bourgeoisie is that capitalist class. Where a lot of the other political parties are trying to find some compromise, but the Bolsheviks, they're totally against it. They want this massive revolution. They want a total social change. And because of this massive publicity that they get from stopping the High Command's military from coming into Petrograd, we see their party numbers by the end of July raise up to about 200,000 party members. And by October, that's nearly doubled to 350,000 members. And this means that their finances are increasing exponentially as well, because the more members you have, the more contributions those members are making. I remember someone asked me in class a while ago, where did these revolutionary parties get their funding from? And a lot of it would have been through wealthy intelligentsia, but also through contributions from their members. If we actually look at these two pie graphs, um, and we look at how many seats or votes the Bolsheviks got, if we look at the first All-Russian Congress, and this is June 1917, so this is a fair bit after the February Revolution, we see the Bolsheviks only getting about 16%. Okay, the big parties here are the SRs and the Mensheviks. Okay, if we look across towards the Second All-Russian Congress, so this is a lot later, and this is um, after all this has happened, and in fact after the October Revolution, we see the Bolsheviks massively increase, and in fact we're talking a 60% increase, a 60% stake in the Soviet. So we're talking a big increase in popularity of the Bolsheviks over this period, and we start to see the Bolsheviks taking control of the Soviets. In fact, the Petrograd Soviet, we see them pass a Bolshevik motion calling for the establishment of a Soviet government. So the Bolsheviks put up this thing saying, we don't want a provincial government anymore. We don't want a Duma. We want the Soviet to take control. And in the Petrograd Soviet, this passes. We see Trotsky, who is a member of the Socialist Revolutionaries, of the Socialist Democrats, become a chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. Trotsky is a fantastic public speaker. And the rise of the Bolsheviks at this time can be linked to the fact that they're the only major political party which stood uncompromisingly for Soviet power. And in fact, Lenin terms this slogan called "All Power to the Soviets," and this has been going on for quite a while. This is their slogan. But the reality is he doesn't want to give all power to the Soviets. He wants all power to the party, to the Bolshevik party. So we see that the Bolsheviks are kind of piggybacking on the people's love of the Soviet. Remember how we talked about in dual power in that debate I tried to make you have of whether the Soviets should have taken power and the Duma should have taken power, and a few people made the comments about how it was the Soviets that the people wanted to take power. So the Soviets were very, very popular, and the Bolsheviks, they have this massive rise in popularity because they're the only political party which is for the Soviets taking power. So who is Trotsky when I talk about him? He was actually born Lev Davidovich Bronstein. He's Jewish. He becomes the founder and the first leader of the Red Army once the Bolsheviks kind of take control of Russia. Originally, it's the Red Guard. I think he has something to do with the Red Guard as well. And then they eventually become the Red Army. So from 1904 to 1917, he considers himself a non-factional social democrat. So you know how we have factions with the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks? He doesn't want to take part in that factional fighting, so he stays out of it. He says he's non-factional. Though we see in 1913 he joins an independent faction. So neither of those two, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it there. The Mezrayonsi? Yeah, don't know. Very small party. There's only about 4,000 members of this party, but they were very well connected with the Petrograd garrison. Some very high-ranking military guys, strategists, all this sort of stuff. And he becomes chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, and he's so well liked that they ends up calling it the Petrograd Soviet is now Trotsky's Guard, ready at a sign from him to storm the coalition. So he has total control over the Petrograd Soviet. And I told you in one of the earlier lessons about how Trotsky was the first person to really see the importance of the Soviet as a political tool. He was a fantastic public speaker, and he was actually probably more well known than Lenin at the time. And during the weeks before the Bolsheviks actually seized power in the October Revolution, he would do public speaking, and he spoke nearly every night at the Cirque Moderne, and he sort of packed houses. And he was a fantastic public speaker. He involved his listeners in the moral drama of the time. He used examples and comparisons from the actual lives of the people who were listening to him talk. So there were a couple of the techniques that he used to really pull the crowd in. And the people considered that Trotsky was one of them. Okay, he wasn't this elitist. He wasn't a member of the intelligentsia. He was as far as the people concerned, he was one of them, which is quite rare when we're talking about these politicians and revolutionary politicians. So Soviet power. When the people wanted the Soviet state power, what was not supposed to be a dictatorship of any one party. Okay, so they wanted all the parties in these Soviets. It wasn't supposed to just be the Bolsheviks running the show. They wanted the Mensheviks in there. They wanted the socialist revolutionaries in there. They wanted the cadets in there. Um, it was supposed to be like a proper government, but in the form of the Soviet. Um, but there's still this us and them mentality, common people versus the landed elite. So the workers and the peasants and just your average Joes compared to those nobilities and stuff. And this is the same political language that we're seeing since 1905. Okay, so that 1905 revolution, Bloody Sunday, and it hasn't really changed much in the 12 years. Um, what the people really want when they're saying they want Soviet powers, they want the chance to control their own lives, to control their own factory environment primarily. They want to have a say in wages, work conditions, all that sort of stuff. Um, so we see strikes beginning to cripple the country from September. Um, and this is mainly due to economic reasons. There's rising inflation. Everything's starting to cost a lot more. People can't afford to buy as much as they could before. And we're actually seeing strikes that are far more widespread than in the past. So we're getting people like city workers, hospital workers, clerical workers who usually haven't been protesting and demonstrating because they're getting hit with these economic problems due to inflation. They're out there striking now as well. And there's massive demands for the whole economy to be restructured. The unions and the factory committees lose control of the strikers, and we start seeing again a rise in looting, crime, drunkenness, vandalism, ethnic conflict, and anti-Jewish pogroms. Okay, so again, we're seeing that anti-Jewish element coming up again and again. This is happening especially out in the country. People are attacking the nobles, their landlords, all that sort of stuff. The weeks before the Bolsheviks actually seized power is considered by some to see Petrograd actually descending into anarchy. They think there's not going to be any order at all. The peasants are really upset that the provincial government, so this is Kerensky's provincial government, have not delivered on the promises that they've made, the majority of which have to do with land reform and the peasants gaining more land. And we start to see really violent uprisings from the peasants. They kill they're killing their landlords. And at the same time, we're usually seeing a setting up of a village Soviet. So when they rise up, they usually destroy the noble, ransack his house, hand out all the land, and set up a Soviet. And the Soviets essentially they're just a new name for the commune elders. But we're seeing more young revolutionaries, educated military men and stuff who have come back to their village, taking part in these Soviets now. So it's not just the old peasants. Up until the Kornilov crisis, Lenin had been opposed to any compromise with the Soviets. Okay, he didn't see them as a good tool. He always wanted a strong and repressive party state. So he wanted the Bolsheviks just to be in charge of everything, and no one else had a say in the matter. And he termed it a dictatorship of the proletariat. That's a really important term that you should try and remember. The dictatorship of the proletariat. Essentially, it means that the workers are the one who are in charge of everything. No one else matters. The proletariat, those blue collar workers, a dictatorship of the proletariat. So in September 14, we have our Democratic Conference, and the Bolsheviks. This is where they start making compromises with the Soviets, and if the Soviet leaders agree to assume the power. From the Duma that we have, the provisional government. If they say, if you guys step up and kick the provisional government out and start running the country, because everyone wants you to, the Bolsheviks will stop plans for an armed uprising. We won't try and overthrow the government, and we'll actually compete for power within the system of the Soviets. So we'll come in as a political party in the Soviets, and we'll let the people vote for us. The conference is an utter disaster, and it demonstrates the Soviets' inability to be a government, essentially. The political ineptitude that a lot of these representatives in the Soviets have. Um, a valid question is, why did the Bolsheviks actually continue with the revolution? They were getting the numbers, as you saw before, 60% um, of the vote, that sort of stuff. Why didn't they just wait until they could actually take over the Soviets themselves? Well, because Lenin didn't want a coalition government. Um, Even though he might have had 60% and might have been able to do whatever he wanted, he wouldn't have been able to do whatever he still would have had to work with the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries and everyone who had those other small percentages. Um, and so that's why we see Lenin, even though the Bolsheviks could essentially get into power, decide that he still wants to go down this military pathway. And a lot of the Bolsheviks in his party, the other leaders, are actually calling for this not to happen, so that they can just form government peacefully. But we see on the 10th of October, Lenin calls a secret meeting of the Bolshevik Central Committee, and he actually only invites, or only 12 of the members attend out of the 21 who kind of run the Bolsheviks. They have a vote on whether they're still going to have an armed uprising, whether they're going to have an armed revolution, and the vote on the armed insurrection passes about 10 to 2. So if you think about it, 10 out of 21 people, he doesn't even have a majority of the Bolshevik Central Committee voting for it, but it goes ahead. So Kerensky realizes what's happening. He tries to move the Petrograd garrison to the front, because you got to remember the Petrograd garrison, these are the guys that revolted in the February Revolution. So he wants them out of the scene. They're the muscle. They're the ones who are making up this Red Guard. And so he tries to move them to the front in World War One, because we're still fighting World War One at this stage. The provisional government was still fighting very hard. They wanted to win. They were getting support from England and America, people who wanted them in the war. So Kerensky tries to move the Petrograd garrison to the front, and the Petrograd garrison pretty much just say no. They institute military revolutionary committees, MRCs, that pretty much just override the senior officers, and they put their own senior officers in place. This happens on the 21st of October, and so essentially, well, not essentially, totally, the provisional government has lost military control. Okay, the Petrograd garrison is no longer in their hands. The Petrograd garrison is now essentially in the hands of the Bolsheviks. At this stage, the Bolshevik leaders don't really want this armed revolution to happen yet. They're holding off. They've got a better date when they want it to happen. Lenin isn't even there. Trotsky's in charge, and he's just trying to tell everyone to wait and hold off. But by the 24th of October, the Red Guards end up taking over the city, essentially. They hold all the strategic points, the railways, all that sort of stuff. And soon after this is when Lenin arrives. And he arrives at the Smolny, which is the where the Duma is being held, and he convinces the committee to begin the insurrection. Okay, so on the 25th of October is essentially the day we have the military coup. And unlike all the other revolutions revolutions I talk about, like Bloody Sunday, February Revolution, this one passes essentially unnoticed by the vast majority of the people in Petrograd. Okay, so we haven't got hundreds of thousands of people out marching and giving stirring speeches. It just doesn't happen. It's very quiet. Some people have argued that the storming of the Winter Palace, that becomes very, very famous in Russian history. A film gets made out of it by Eisenstein about 10 years later, and it becomes a part of communist mythology. And it's not really a storming. More people say it's more like a house arrest. There's not real defenders left of the provincial government. Most of them have gone home by this stage. There is about... Okay, let's look at it from the other side first. On the Bolshevik side, it ends up being an absolute comedy of errors. They were supposed to attack the Winter Palace quite early on in the day, but the Baltic sailors who are supposed to be coming don't show up, and the rest of the Red Guard won't do it without the Baltic sailors. So they're all finally waiting. The Baltic sailors finally show up, and the attack is meant to start with field guns on the Peter and Paul Fortress, which is overlooking the Winter Palace, and they're supposed to fire on the Winter Palace to start it all off. And so they go up to do it and realise that these guns are all rusted relics, and they're actually not operational guns. They're just kind of there for decoration. So they end up dragging up alternative cannons, and those alternative cannons they don't have any ammunition for. So it's an absolute disaster. The signal to actually start it all off is a red lantern that's meant to be raised above this fortress. But when it comes to happen, they realise they don't actually have a red lantern. They look everywhere, and they can't find a red lantern anywhere. And the guy in charge ends up going off to buy a red lantern, and it's foggy, and he gets lost in a bog, And when he finally does show back up, the lantern that he's finally found isn't even red. So it's a bit of a schmozzle. The troops that we see inside that are defending the provisional government, there's about 3,000 to begin with, and this is made up of Cossacks, young military cadets, from the military school, so they're not really good soldiers, and 200 women from the Shock Battalion of Death. So this is women's battalion as well. So they got 3,000 troops in there, and they don't even have enough food to feed everyone for dinner. So by the time dinner comes around, about 2,700 of these soldiers have just nicked off, and they've actually gone into town to have dinner, and they don't intend on coming back. So the provincial government they're worried. They start sending out requests for help all over the country. They sent out a request. The only actually people that listen to them is the Duma itself, with 300 deputies line up in columns of 4 in their suits and everything and march off. I think they have like a bottle of water or wine or something and a loaf of bread each to go and help the besieged provincial government, and they say they're going to stand in front of the Bolshevik cannon. Okay, it's very symbolic what they're trying to do. They get less than a block before they're halted by Bolshevik sailors. One of the sailors pulls a gun, and the leader of the Duma opens his jacket and tells him to shoot him. The sailors realise this is all a bit comical and threaten to spank them if they don't go back to the Duma. So we have these 300 deputies promptly turn around and march straight back to the Duma. As this was all meant to be timed so that it happened before the Soviet Congress opened, the Congress ends up opening as the assault on the Winter Palace commences, because it's been such a schmozzle. And the Bolsheviks do not have an absolute majority. The Mensheviks and SRs denounce the violence that's going on outside, the Socialist Revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, and essentially just walk out of the Soviet Congress. And this clears the path for a Bolshevik dictatorship. If the Mensheviks and the SRs had stayed there, then we would have seen a very vastly different outcome. And they acknowledge this later. They acknowledge it was a mistake for them to leave, but they do. And this allows the Bolsheviks to absolutely monopolize the Soviet. So if we actually look back at the event itself, the February Revolution itself, Trotsky claims that there's about 25 to 30,000 people involved in it, which is roughly about 5% of all the workers and soldiers in Petrograd. So we're talking a very small amount compared to normal. Less than probably 15,000 took part, probably 10 to 15,000 took part in the actual storming of the Winter Palace, and it was actually probably drastically less than that. So the big difference is there's no really big crowds like we've seen in the past. This isn't the February Revolution with that party atmosphere and everyone coming out. This one is run by the Bolsheviks, and you can tell that it isn't a popular uprising just because no one even knows it's going on, essentially. I think this is a great quote by a guy called Volodya Averbach, and it's his account of walking home through the Palace Square, so near the Winter Palace, at the time that the Bolsheviks were readying themselves for their final assault on the Winter Palace. And he says this: "The streets were completely deserted. The night was quiet, and the city seemed dead. We could even hear the echo of our own footsteps on the pavement." Okay, so it's not a big party atmosphere or lots of noise. The place is dead. So what happens after they take the Winter Palace? Well, as per usual, we get more rioting and all that sort of stuff. They find a massive wine cellar, and it's actually stocked with really, really good wine. It's got the Chateau de Yquem, 1847 vintage, the Tsar's personal favourite vintage himself. His absolute favourite vintage was in stock there, and there was a lot of it. The palace is vandalised. Everyone gets blind drunk. Sailors and soldiers end up robbing and killing people just for fun. Just go around to all the wealthy neighborhoods and just end up robbing and killing everyone. Um, the Bolsheviks end up setting up machine guns to try and deter the looters. They end up pumping the wine out of this wine cellar, pumping it out into the street, and people are just drinking the wine out of the gutters. Martial law is finally imposed to control the rioting and the looting. The Bolsheviks are quite surprised that this is happening. The reality is a lot of these soldiers and sailors have only shown up not because they want a revolution, but because they're aware that when you have a violent uprising, the benefit is that you get to do a lot of this raping and pillaging and robbing of the rich. So, to end up, the forum topic for this week is, why do you think the October Revolution ended in anarchy and drunken violence? Okay, so pop over to the forum and put your comments in there.